Okay, councillors, into the meeting proper. Apologies. We have an apology from Councillor Steadman and Councillor Hall, so I'll move that those apologies be sustained. Seconded Councillor Wilson. All in favour? Aye. Against? Carried.
I'm just wondering, in light of my question at the public forum, before we get into the proper, whether under Standing Order 9.13, discussion of minor matters not on the agenda, you could add in that we do move a motion of support for that today, so that we can have that letter that was suggested was needed at the start. I think it is a minor matter in the big picture of things, but I think under the standing orders we were able to do that.
So you wish to, under those standing orders, to have it put on as an agenda item?
Well, it's not. It doesn't have to be an agenda item if it is a minor matter. It's just that you can discuss it if you decide as chair, is my understanding. Well, I may be wrong.
Mr. Chairman, I was reading the standing orders this morning in respect of another matter, and there's a specific standing order that precludes making decisions as a result of presentations at public fora. And I've been grappling with exactly the same issue. I'm wondering if we could somehow ask the Mayor if there were any, on the assumption there's no objection to a letter of support of the kind being prepared for approval at council or sometime, because I think it would be great if we could provide a letter of support for this initiative, but I just think we're caught by the standing orders doing it right now.
It's already on my to-do list.
Yeah. I have a cunning suggestion just been passed to me that when we come to the discussion around the Provincial Growth Fund, it could probably sit in that item. All right, now Councillor Benson. The
standing order is 14.4 if people would like to have a look at it, and it might be one that we need to dump actually. But
all right, confirmation of the agenda. I know Councillor Benson Pope, you wish to move something.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'd like the meeting to consider adding a further matter for debate as item 8A or some such, namely the proposed downside or potential downsizing of the New Zealand Post operations at Dunedin North and Dunedin South for reasons of urgency. The matter's been drawn to the attention of Mr. Christie and also Mr. Pickford, and Mr. Christie can talk about it, but it's just that if this matter is being consulted on with staff as we speak, and I think it's important that we avail ourselves of the opportunity to have a discussion, and we may, in due course, if you put this on the agenda, I will move that we convey our concern about the potential downsizing to New Zealand Post and to local MPs.
So do I have a seconder for that? Councillor Hawkins.
At the same time, you that all about the standing order.
Yes, I will once we get this one. So, councillors, I'm going to put that motion to include that item on the agenda. All in favour? Aye. Against? Carried. So then that brings us to confirming the agenda with the addition of item 8A, which has just been outlined, and that we confirm, and that in regard to Standing Order 21.1, option C be adopted in relation to moving and seconding and speaking to amendments. So I'll move that, seconded by Councillor Wiley. All in favour? Aye. Against? Carried. Declarations of interest. Councillors, does anybody have any changes to their... Okay, if not, I'll move that the committee notes the elected members' interest register and confirms the proposed management plan for elected members' interests. Seconded by Councillor Wiley. All in favour? Aye. Against? Carried. That brings us on to item 5, long-term performance of Dunedin's tourism sector, the Infometrics report, and I think we're being joined by Bree and Suze. Just while they're coming up, John will introduce the item.
So councillors will be aware that they were offered the opportunity to be briefed on this paper by Benji Patterson of Infometrics. It's the same report that he spoke to when he briefed you, and I guess we're open to taking questions on that report from councillors today.
So, councillors, questions? Councillor Moore.
Yeah, look, I had a couple of questions. First, I was noting that the highlights of the report, and I think they are really interesting. I did have a closer look at the figures, and I saw that, to me, which was a positive, was the increase of international tourism as the way it played a part. I suppose you could argue that we don't need to rely quite so much on national or domestic tourism. And I'm just wondering, do you have a view on where the ratio should sit? We seem to have been sitting about a 2/3, 1/3 split for a number of years. You got any views on that?
I mean, I think we'd probably have to look a little bit more into that before we could give a firm answer, and that might come round to, I guess, infrastructure capacity and that sort of thing as well. But I don't think we're too far off. You know, we have discussed that you wouldn't necessarily want it to look at, say, a 50-50 ratio because, you know, from an international perspective, if there was a global crisis, a financial crisis, bird flu, any of those things that have affected travel in the past, you wouldn't want our economy to be relying on a high level of international spend.
Yeah. And I just did note the increases that were recorded in the paper recently. It said there was a 137% increase in domestic, and I've just looked at the figures and I'm not sure that that's right. I think 12% is the figure that I've worked out's about right. Have you got any comments on that?
Without seeing the context of the data that we'd be looking at, I can't comment directly, and we can go back to that figure that's been quoted. But however, with the recent report, we're now using the NTREs, which have been identified as the core data set for this measure at a national level. So we're confident with the data that's included in this report.
Yeah, so on page 29 of the report, it shows a spend of 732 million, and of that it says that 517 million is the current domestic spend, and in 2014 the domestic spend was 469 million, I believe.
Yes, 462 million. Yes.
462, so that's an increase of how much is that?
That's roughly 12%.
12%,
Yeah.
yeah. So the
domestic.
137% figure that was quoted a few weeks ago was clearly wrong.
Yes, in that context it is.
Yep, okay, thank you.
Councillor O'Malley.
Just want to touch briefly on the Airbnb data. It looks like around about 22% of the nights stayed are Airbnb nights, and obviously they won't be able to be captured in a lot of the metrics that we use for capturing the tourism spend because they're not under the commercial heading, so they're not captured under the commercial bed nights. So do you think that is the reason that the commercial bed nights appear to be rising slowly? And that in fact it's not that there are less people coming into the city spending the night, but they're going into an area which is not yet captured under the metrics?
I think that is a contributing factor, and as you state, we're not capturing that spend through our spend data, and indications from our percentage growth at a commercial accommodation perspective would indicate that with this growth it looks that it is slower than perhaps what other centres have been reporting. The other thing, however, is that although that spend is not being captured out for accommodation, we are still capturing other spend around retail and attractions and activities. So we still are able to capture that spend, but not the accommodation spend for those particular visitors.
Right, so then actually that's interesting, because then when you take those numbers, they are more reflective of everybody coming through the city if people just are still doing the same thing they used to do. Are they showing a higher rate of rise than the commercial accommodation rise?
Marginally greater, so the actual increase in spend is roughly about 6% on the prior year for the previous 12 months, and our accommodation increases around about 3%.
So yeah, so that again would imply that there is a accommodation night data set that we're missing, and that's, I think it's reasonable to assume that's probably captured in the Airbnb nights.
Yes, and hence why we commissioned that piece of work to do some analysis to identify what that proportion would be.
Great, thank you.
Councillor Hawkins.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and my apologies for not being at the briefing with a conflicting engagement, so apologies if this has been covered already. I have two questions. One is around methodology and the difficulty that arises from comparing growth expressed as a percentage, because coming off a low base, growth can look disproportionately high when it's expressed as a percentage, and that's it happens again in the subsequent paper, and I've got specific questions when we get to that one. But do we get the information in its raw data form, and do you think that would be helpful as context to talk around some of these? I think it looks very impressive in the Clutha district. I don't know if it's, I quite like Surat Bay too, but it could just be that, cycle tourism, for instance, has kick-started an industry where none such may have existed. I don't know, but it's difficult to tell from this.
In terms of doing comparisons, if you're using the same base, and the MTREs, which a lot of this information in the report has been based on, it's the data set that's been used at a national level as a considered the standard or the metric that across New Zealand. You're right, if you've got a smaller base, your percentage increase will look greater, and that's when you do run into debate about whose share is greater going forward. What you need to temper this information with other metrics as well. And one of the key areas that we also look at is about trying to increase market share of the market. So whether it's domestic or international, that's a goal of ours as well. But we also are mindful of not broadening the metrics too wide, so that there is some sustainability in what data sets we're using. And yes, in terms of Infometrics, we were commissioned to do this piece of work, and they did actually use the raw data. They were able to have access to the raw data sets and to get us the results in terms of reporting back how we had commissioned the piece of work.
Yeah, thank you. And perhaps there's something for Mr. Christie to consider, just in terms of the introductory reports that go alongside these. Some context around some of those seeming anomalies might not be unhelpful.
Yeah, noted.
Thank you. And my second question might be for you too, John, and it's just, I wonder whether, because we talk about I mean, this is about tourism, but it could be about any industry, and we talk about what percentage of the local economy comes from any one sector. Is there any international evidence that your team draw upon in terms of what's a good, at what point basically can a sector grow to a point where it is a risk to the sustainability of our local economy, or make us overly vulnerable to shocks in one particular? I'm assuming it's north of 10%, but I'm curious as to whether that kind of thinking is going on, or that kind of literature review has been done at any point?
Look, it's early on in our thinking. We are aware of the fact that we can be over-dependent on some sectors, and we have been undertaking a piece of work internally to look at how we're representing growth in the economic development strategy that will be sustainable across all sectors. That means we do need to start looking at what we're capturing by the way of data that will inform us about where we may be potentially running into areas of higher risk in terms of fluctuations in the market. But it's pretty early in its thinking, and we'd need to really dig into that a little bit deeper.
Councillor Wilson.
Again, apologies for me as well for not attending that workshop where I should have probably been to ask this particular question. But the fundamentals of getting some of this information, and I live in an area where there's a lot of tourism, substantially grown in the last 10, 15 years, but a lot of the bookings are done in Central Otago. And I'm just wondering, how does that pair out? Where does the data come that backs up this perception, or these figures? Is it done at the FPOS till level, or is it done at a level where things are booked? Now, I know, for example, that there may be substantial numbers of rail trailers, for example, on Taieri Gorge, who pay for it seemingly through a Central Otago District Office based company. Where does that statistics get collected? Is it collected?
So it is based on card spend, and it is at source. So depending on the mix of visitor type, some of that spend will be not captured in this data.
Yeah, or it could be captured somewhere else.
Yes.
And so the comparisons come in uneven. Okay. And so the other part of that, and I think that question was, I think it's been covered, but hotel occupancy is covered at source, but if it's an Airbnb or a different type of accommodation other than motels or hotels, that is not necessarily captured at all.
So it's not, that's right, it's not captured in this data. So the other piece of Airbnb information that we captured here is through completely another set of data. So that, it's almost off the radar.
Off the radar. So if you've got 46%, I think is the figure that I saw in the report that said 46% of the capacity in Dunedin is Airbnb, and it may be at a lower rate of people occupancy, but that can skew the figures quite substantially. So there could be substantially more people staying in Dunedin. It's just not being measured in the traditional forms.
That's right.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Gary.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Suze, my first question is just to touch on what Councillor Lord raised around the figures quoted, that I quoted. Now, those figures were put together in good faith, and I wonder, can those be gone, because they were from another set of data, can those be checked?
Yes,
and come back to me?
Yes, we can go back and
Thank
just
you.
confirm where that information,
Excellent.
What source we used for that information.
Thank you. Secondly, there was an interesting slide during one of the presentations during Trends, which was entitled, "Are we becoming victims of our own success?" And what it spoke to was about community sensitivity to growth in tourism. And they quoted some figures on annual arrivals versus local populations. So at the very top of the list was Iceland, at about 5 to 1, 5 arrivals to 1 person in the population. New Zealand was down in 5th place at 0.8 to 1. When we're talking about tourism, international visitor numbers, do you think there's a point that's coming quite soon around community sensitivity to that growth, and that in fact fast and large growth is not necessarily a positive thing for our community? What would be your comments on that?
I think it would probably, I don't think we'd necessarily want to start tempering it at this point, but I think it's probably about how the city is managing the visitors' impact on these communities. So I guess, when you look at certain communities like, a surrounding Tunnel Beach, for example, a very popular attraction, but as long as, the city can help manage, the impact of that area, then perhaps it's not going to affect it as much. But I think also the Mood of the Nation survey, which is probably where it's come from, its pressure points are probably in a couple of areas. Obviously, we understand Queenstown, that has a large impact. The growth is having impact on the community, particularly from a housing perspective, but I don't think we are sort of anywhere close to that point.
There was an interesting radio program about this, targeting a Marama, and they talked about the three things were parking, toilets and rubbish, so that would probably be true of the pressure area as well.
Yeah, and I think that's, with the development and adoption of the DDP, then now the city can work, a whole of city approach to tackling some of these issues so that we're well prepared for it.
Thank you. And my final question is around Chinese spend. So we know that there's been a huge growth in our Chinese visitors, and my understanding is that they typically use cash. So presumably that's not caught in the visitor spend in the same way if it's through electronic means. What would be your comments about that, Suze?
You're correct. A lot of the spend is, they do use cash, our Chinese visitors. So what we've got is an industry and in conjunction with our operators is looking at what technologies we can employ to get that, to actually capture that spend. So there are a number of systems in place, and we're working with operators and providing links to them or connections to have a better awareness of how they can capture that. It's not only about capturing the spend and from a reporting perspective, but by having mechanisms by which they can actually increase the value of spend by each visitor. So that's going to be, that's a challenge from a city perspective to work out what methods and mechanisms are there to support that increase.
Thank you.
Councillor Lord.
Actually, Christine almost asked my question. It was about tracking cash, and I was thinking, for example, if someone flies in from Shanghai and spends a night in a hotel in Auckland and then he withdraws $2,000 on his card and takes that in cash, I'm just wondering, so some of those anomalies, like where we're considering, is it a problem? I think tracking of expenditure is a good way it's a good metric, but I'm wondering if it was a flaw. For example, if someone withdrew the cash in Auckland and then came and spent it at the casino here, or just paid cash for a variety of things, it could be an Airbnb or whatever, do you know if that cash card that goes into the hotel in Auckland would somehow, or do they just not measure cash? Do you know if they track cash at all?
I don't know the answer to that, and I can find that out. However, my understanding is that behind the scenes they're able to, there's a coding system by which they can put it to retail or accommodation or petrol, and so it's likely that the cash isn't included, so cash withdrawals, but we can confirm that and come back to you on that.
Thank you. Yep.
Councillor Wiley.
Thank you. I'm just following a similar vein of a question around capturing the data, because where I'm coming from is the cruise ships and passengers booking through the ship and through ID Tours or agents like that. Would that data have been captured here?
It is not likely. It's only spent at source, okay. So within the city, okay. Within the RTO.
So the previous data we were using, or what the data that TIA uses, how does that differ from what we're receiving now to what they present?
I'm not too sure exactly what you're referring to for TIA, but the previous, there was a data set which was called indexing, yep. And it was based on a 2008 base, and they treated that at 100%. So what it was recording was actually a shift in movement against that 208 base. That in 2016 it was decided that data set was no longer relevant and appropriate for use at a national level, and so it's now defunct. I can't comment on, I'm not quite too sure about which TIA data you're referring to.
So I guess what I'm trying to get or ask is that when someone stays in a motel or attractions have their numbers coming through, who's capturing that data and who's presenting that to the industry, presenting that to government for room nights, things like that?
I think that's the MBIE data that comes through this vehicle, the MRTEs. Yeah, which has been a change from the index model that Suze was talking about. They found that that model wasn't robust and in some cases wasn't that accurate, hence the shift.
Councillor Elder.
Hi, thank you for your report. I just had a number of questions. We've got high air and B&B numbers, 46%. What do you think are the causes of some of that? I know that's interpreted.
So for the period that they tested, or some of they tested, was identifying that based on the capacity that was available through the accommodation, commercial accommodation, over and above, and that's for that same period, that the number of rooms made available represented in the Airbnb space represented another 46% of capacity. In terms of the what it represents is that there'll be a number of factors. It could be the number of people see this as an opportunity for additional income, and there's also a little bit of distressed inventory. Some commercial providers actually use Airbnb type channels or that book a back type channels to actually put their accommodation through those channels as well. So I don't know, I can't speak directly to why people would make those choices, but the other thing is that from a visitor's perspective, that they do that going to someone's home and having a full range of facilities available to them gives them a different experience. So there will be influences by both parties to what would why they would choose an Airbnb type of accommodation to a hotel.
So we also have quite high occupancy with commercial. Would some of that be the lack of commercial accommodation factored into that? Like for concerts, events and bits and pieces?
We do have bottlenecks at different times of the year, and so in terms of, you're right, particularly over the high season, there is demand on a set number of rooms and beds available. But how that is actually often balanced out is that in the shoulder season, there's not the same level of demand.
Yes.
And that is why, from a marketing perspective, we encourage activity or market to attract people here during that time.
Another question. Over time, has our domestic demand come here increased, like say in the last 5 years or whatever?
So we can, from the numbers that we've got here, there's an indication that yes, there is there is more spend, and there is a small amount of growth in the commercial accommodation space as well. We are from a marketing perspective, from Enterprise Dunedin's perspective, we have seen more demand in terms of events and concerts. We're also, with the work that we do in the conference space for through business events, there's demand from that sector as well.
Thank you.
Councillor Wilson.
Data is an interesting beast and gives interesting results, but I'm just wondering if there's, aside from this, because some of this sounds really quite interesting, but what it doesn't measure, and I'm not quite sure we've got it in a different format, is the number of bed nights in Dunedin in hotels or motels and how that's increased, I think, quite substantially in the last few years. And considering there is a number of projects for hotel rooms, new development happening, I presume that there's quite a lot of confidence in the market in Dunedin at present. In fact, I'd say probably as high as it has been. I mean, we've got the old post offices converted. That must have been a substantial number of beds have already come into this market, and yet the occupancy rates have continued to go up, which is great. And so I'm just wondering, have we got that measured somewhere else where we can see quite clearly the number of beds available? And
yes, so we do. We do have data through the commercial accommodation monitor. So, you know, if there is particular, if there's some more data or information you would like to see around that, we can provide that to you.
well,
We do, the nights have increased by around about 3.5% on the prior period, or prior 12 months.
the bed nights, but I'm just talking about literally the total number of beds, because
In terms of capacity, and capacity is quite an interesting thing. Our occupancy, you're right, is we have one of the highest capacity occupancies in New Zealand.
yeah.
Though you would only need to, you'd have to report it over I'd recommend reviewing it over, say, a 3 to 5 year period, because at any given time, different premises take off capacity for renovating and various things as well. But there definitely has been an increase overall, and we can provide that information to you.
Well, I think it's just interesting considering the trend, and I'm just wondering the confidence that's out there in the market with new developments coming on board or being proposed. I presume that comes with some understanding that the capacity restraints that we've got at the moment are actually meaning some things aren't happening. Because, well, if you haven't got capacity to do X number of beds, because Dunedin's pretty well at times sold out, then I'm presuming that's giving some confidence to these new hotels that are coming online.
Yes, and also it would also lend itself to the Airbnb space as well.
Thank you.
Councillor Hawkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A lot of discussion going on, not just here but around the country, around the relationship, what the relationship looks like between the sharing economy, and Airbnb is only one example of that. There's Booker Batch and other providers too, but good marketing on their part to be the synonym. And the commercial sector, and I did note, it was quite interesting actually, that the majority of listings here are for a single room. Now, if I was travelling, I might consider booking a motel or a hotel unit or a whole apartment, but I'm not going to rent out a private room in someone's house. So I just wonder how useful it is in terms of comparing those two total data sets, and whether a more kind of granular breakdown might be helpful in terms of comparing trends, because I find it hard to believe that, you know, the hotel market is competing with someone who's renting out a spare room in the suburbs somewhere.
I guess international trends as well is that people are looking for a more authentic experience when they come into a country. They want to immerse themselves with locals and what locals are doing. So I guess in that respect, you could look at an Airbnb like actually staying at a bed and breakfast. It's a very similar concept. You come in, you have hosts. They'll cook you breakfast, they'll share their experiences, and they'll give you recommendations, you know, based on a kind of a like-minded point of view. So I think that whilst, you know, I'm with you, that's probably not how I'd travel, but I certainly think there is more and more of a demand for it. And certainly now there's an increase in the growth of, you know, female travelling on their own as well. So there's also that sort of safety aspect as well.
Is that surveying, is that data being gathered, or that, I mean, maybe it's qualitative, which is trickier, but it'd be good to, I mean, this survey probably isn't the mechanism for it, but that would be good to know how beyond anecdata, how this stuff is tracking. Do we have access to that kind of information in any form through national agencies or?
We can go back to through to Infometrics, who gather this information for us and find out that layer of information that's available. And there is from a national perspective, there other RTOs, regional tourism officers, are trying to understand the space a lot better, because it's not obviously Dunedin's not the only destination that this is, the mix has significantly changed the landscape in terms of accommodation and what the overall offering is.
Councillor O'Malley.
It's just a quick follow-up to that statement. You noted that Airbnbs and bread and breakfast themselves are very similar in what they offer to the customer. And obviously you would note that we already rate B&Bs at a different rate. So I think that one of the things that the industry is pointing out is that if you have a rating system that identifies a service, that needs to be applied equally across the board. And if we're missing Airbnb, then we should either pull it back off B&Bs or find the Airbnbs. Would you agree? Mr. Christie probably has the answer on that.
I know that's a question that's going to be answered as part of the Rates Funding Working Party review of that issue.
I have one question, just to get it right in my mind. If I look at the commercial bed nights, 25,000 bed nights, would it be fair to say if you add that to the 65,500 bed nights that are in Airbnb, does that give a closer picture to the bed nights for the city?
It's probably not as simple as that, because there's also a lot of people coming in from a visiting friends and relatives perspective. I'm not sure if that's how that's captured, but
at a simplistic level, potentially yes. However, as Breeze pointed out, there are other options available, which we have experienced, for example, when we're hosting Masters games through the halls of residences. And so there is, in terms of capacity, we're seeing that the landscape or the mix is changing quite significantly, and it's changed from the previous summer to this summer as well. And I think it's my estimate that we're going to continue to see growth in this space. But there is then still the challenge of ensuring that we have as a city, that we have quality accommodation available for our visitors. So that commercial space is still a very viable option and needs to be seriously considered as part of the overall mix.
Yeah, the reason I asked the question was that the report is saying there's only been very slow growth in commercial accommodation, which might suggest, if you only read that on its own, that there hadn't been much increase in the number of people visiting the city, because there was only a very slow growth in commercial. But when you then, if you look at Airbnb, it's more than doubled, and it's now something like about 6.5% of the total bed nights for the city. So in fact, what I'm trying to understand from you guys is whether we should be crying into our morning breakfast because we only got a slow growth in commercial, or whether we should be looking at the bigger picture and saying, well, for various reasons, which may be capacity, commercial has had slow growth, but there are other forms of accommodation that are growing and providing additional accommodation on top of that that's changing the perspective.
I agree. We need to look at the bigger picture in terms of the total capacity available and where those opportunities are available going forward.
Yeah. So perhaps that's something that we could look at in terms of gathering our stats, whether we can get a better fix on that. Okay, I've had indicated to me that Councillor Gary wishes to move the noting of this report. Do I have a seconder? Yeah. Councillor Elder. Councillors, debate. There is none. Yeah. Councillor Lord.
Okay, I'll turn my microphone on. I was just commenting, I think that there's some really positive stuff in this report. I think one of the things that I took from that is that we are 8% of our GDP comes from tourism, as opposed to a national average of 5.5%, which is 2.5% better than the rest of the country. Well, it's 2.5% better than the average. I was quite impressed that only education and health employ more people, with 6,771, was it? 6,701, sorry, people, full-time equivalents employed in the sector. So I was really impressed with that figure. I didn't really have any comments about our growth as percentages of other cities, because I know myself that often, for example, I would be considered a domestic tourist when I fly out of the country via Auckland and I spend a night on either side, and often they are significant. You know, you end up arriving in Auckland at 8 o'clock at night with a family of 6 people, and you suddenly spend $400 in the restaurant for tea. And you do the same when you come back 3 weeks later, but your trip was never to go to Auckland, and they were a lucky unintended consequence of my trip to America or wherever. But I think the percentage increase is a valid way of measuring, but I do think that it is interesting to note that perhaps we should recognise that the figure that we quoted wasn't correct, and that maybe we should be apologising to Norcom, and I'm happy to do that. So, yeah.
I think it's been quite clearly stated that there was some confusion whether it was right or wrong, and that was articulated in the question from Kristen Gary. And to say it was wrong until we know it was wrong, because it was done on different data, I think is really unfair to... So I think it's an incorrect statement at the present. It's my point of order. It hasn't been clarified. The point of order is that Councillor Lord has reiterated a issue that isn't set, and has said that something was wrong, when we've established that we don't know that it was wrong yet.
I think, from my point of view in answering that, I won't grant it as a point of order, but I think it is something that, Councillor Lord, you should note that we don't know yet. So we can have whatever thoughts we have on the matter, but we haven't got a finite answer.
I was just going off the report, and the report clearly shows that we've had a 12% increase in domestic growth. So if there's some other data that's different to that, I'm happy to see it, but that's what the report says. Yeah.
Mayor Cull.
Okay, I just want to, I welcome this report. It's very positive, and I think it's timely in that we had 1 or 2 submissions during the annual plan or the long-term plan process, which would lead us to believe that the tourism industry was going to a hell in a handcart, and we were largely responsible. And what this shows is that there is a higher spend, there's more employment in the tourism industry. We know that there are more flights coming in, and they don't come in unless the seats are full. They don't put them on unless the seats can be sold. So I think this paints a very positive picture. But a caution, and that is that if we believed that our tourism industry wasn't doing well, and we frantically ran after more tourists, we would actually be doing the wrong thing, because we are getting them. Where we should be concentrating is on our capacity and our ability to serve the visitors that come, and make sure that the offer that we have is sustainable, because that's what's the most important thing in the long run for our city. Just chasing greater numbers, if we can't be confident that we can serve them all as well as they need to be, could lead us to actually a degraded offering. So I think this is a timely reminder that we're actually tracking pretty well, that the visitors are coming, but it does mention in the odd place there's constraints around capacity, and that's where we need to be putting our attention to make sure that our tourism offering is as good as it can be.
Councillor Wiley.
Thank you. Yeah, I thought this was a very good report presented to us. You know, I guess any time you look at statistics, you can always find better statistics or worse statistics, but you know, you're always trying to find the best statistics you get, and this really does capture quite a bit of what's going on around the city. The key points that I took out was that really when we look at, 6,701 jobs, or 10.9% of all jobs in Dunedin are tourism related. Now that's really key for our city, I think, and it's great to see. And it's growing. That's the main thing. The other part is that it also highlights to me is, are we telling our story strong enough? And it touches on what Mayor Cole just said. We don't want an influx of essentially tourists coming in that are going to go for the whistle stops and all the freebies. We want tourists that kind of come and enjoy our city. Instead of staying one night, staying 2 nights, really getting the best and enjoying what we have to offer. And I think it's really about, and having gone through the long-term plan, one of the things that frustrated me was we didn't really put any more money into economic development and really grow our tourism budget. And this, to me, really shows that there is good opportunities in tourism for the city, great opportunities for our youth, but it's also when you look across the city and see how everybody else benefits and the vibe it brings. And I think that's the really important part, is you can actually feel when cruise ships are in town how positive the city is, and there are a lot of good things happening, and this data captures most of it. I think Airbnb is a real issue, and we'll face that at another committee meeting, and we'll go from there. But yeah, good report there.
Councillor Gary, your right of reply.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The first thing I'd like to clarify is just to reiterate the answer I gave in regard to the quoted figures. Thank you for raising it, Councillor Lord. As I said earlier, those figures were given in good faith by staff, and they have agreed that they will go back and check, and it was from a different set of data as far as we know. So that will be done, and I just reiterate that. In terms of this report, what is very encouraging for me to see is that the growth in figures has, as I talk anecdotally around the city, assisted with the smoothing out of seasonality. And one of the things that we heard from the Minister of Tourism at Trends was about the potential for careers in tourism in our city and in the nation, particularly for our young people, rather than for jobs. And they're two different things. And one of the obstacles to that is seasonality. And the really encouraging thing is that the figures are starting to show, and anecdotally we're starting to hear that seasonality is smoothing out. And that's coming from a whole lot of different areas. It's coming from our festivals. It's coming from our growth in numbers. We've got 1 in 9 jobs that is associated with tourism in the city. But along with that comes a risk, so that if you have some disruptor in terms of it that is way beyond our control, we've just seen the volcano in Hawaii, for example, then the exposure internationally is something that we can be grateful for, that we don't have a huge exposure. In terms of the comments I made earlier, the questions I made earlier around where these figures take us, and community sensitivity. There's one thing that the Mayor mentioned about visitor experience and the importance of that being a very positive experience for our visitors. The important part of that is that we have the community on board as well. Because the moment that you get resentment within the community about the number of tourists, then you have a problem. And we have seen that to some degree with our Freedom campers, although that's not covered in these figures. But I just leave you with a thought that you never know who's coming into the city as a visitor, be they a budget visitor or a higher value visitor. And the example I give is what we've just learnt in the last 48 hours, that Meghan Markle came as a possibly Freedom camper in a camper van to New Zealand, round the South Island, and she's coming back to visit, I understand. So I leave you with that thought.
All right, councillors, I'm going to put it. All in favour? Against? Carried. And so we move on to Infometrics Quarterly Economic Monitor Report for December 2017. And I think we've got Fraser joining us? Yep. I think John will give a little bit of context and then we'll open it up for questions.
Yep, so councillors, we're producing these reports on a quarterly basis just to inform you of some of the metrics that we look back on in terms of our performance over the past quarter, and in particular how that links to our economic development strategy where we can. We're always keen to get feedback on whether or not we're capturing the right data. If you are looking for information outside of these metrics, we can note that and take that back for the next report, and we're happy to take questions on this today. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Mr. Leggett. Just a couple of questions around the report, or at least what the report reports on. I'm curious, and you may not be able to answer these. I'm curious as to the rationale behind using car registration and traffic flows as a proxy for economic success when it could easily be a proxy for poor planning. I'm not being intentionally facetious. It's just hard to know what's causing those things, and the fact that it's included here suggests that we're using it as a measurement of success somehow.
I tend to agree with you, Councillor Hawkins. That's probably something that I'm not best placed to advise on, but it's something that we can take up with Infometrics. As I understand, these quarterly reports pick up on a series of indicators and benchmarks across councils within New Zealand, so it's like with like. Why those particular matrices are used, we can certainly get a little bit more clarification back from Infometrics within there.
Yeah, that'll be helpful, thank you. And sorry, I may have misinterpreted the introduction. I assumed that these were all things that we had asked for, but is this a standard thing that's done across regions? Oh, okay, good. Okay. The other thing is, I mean, there are a couple of related stats around unemployment and around the number of people who are on job seeker support. And I wonder if any data is being, and I don't know if it's the Household Labour Survey would capture it or not, I just don't know enough about that methodology, but around the degree of, or the prevalence of underemployment. Because what we're seeing with a more casual workforce in the gig economy is people have jobs, but maybe not jobs that pay them enough to live on, and so they're not on job seeker support and they're not unemployed, but that doesn't mean they're not vulnerable. And so is that something that can be captured or reported on?
Yeah, Fraser might want to answer more on this question too. We can certainly capture what further data on that. What would be interesting for councillors to note around this is that there are some seasonality impacts on this particular set of data. So we know there are a lot of students, for example, that go off student allowances and go on to student benefits. Both students that are at a tertiary level and those that are leaving school. So your quarter to the end of March will drop remarkably from these stats. The year on year does concern us a little bit, and we'd like to dig into that a little bit more to find out, what the causes of that might be.
Thank you. And I mean, there are obviously, there are factors like being a former refugee resettlement centre, which may impact on those things. But just finally, and I know that GDP figures are one of our high-line goals. And so it's helpful to get those figures, but considering the work that Treasury are currently doing and broadening their benchmarking for what national success looks like beyond GDP, and I know that's under development, but will we be looking to report back on whatever those agreed? Is it likely that those broader terms can be incorporated into this kind of regular reporting easily?
We're certainly aware of the work that Treasury has been doing, and we've actually been giving some thinking to those broader measures ourselves over the last 12 months. It makes sense to use a similar degree of matrices, and we are hopeful that we can actually start bringing those sort of additional quality of life measures back within your wellness, wellbeing measures back into this report.
Councillor Lord.
Yeah, actually, I didn't quite hear what John Christie just spoke about, but I was wondering about the non-residential consents and the fact that that's dropped a lot. And I'm just wondering, in a city the size of Dunedin with for example, something like the DCC, or could that be something like even a consent to repair Ross Creek Reservoir or something like that that skewered it? Like, while 2017 looks like a particularly good year and we look bad at the moment, if you look at the years through 2012 to 2016, we're not a mile off the pace. And I'm just wondering if you know what the factors that may have, could it even be something like the dental school and something else? But it just seems to me doesn't appear to be the reality of what I see.
Yes, that's a good point, Councillor. The non-residential consents do get impacted heavily by major redevelopments, so the dental school's one of those, and we would see that from time to time on other projects. Hospital rebuild's going to really skew those results as well. They're all good, positive projects, but they're very lumpy. Yep. Make the next year look bad, though.
No further questions? Councillor.
I'm intrigued with these, taking on point my question before in the last paper about the number of bed nights available in Dunedin comparatively, but it's also the quality of the bed nights. Now, if I was looking at this and thought, the New Zealand average has been heightened by motels of the lower end being filled by people who are otherwise homeless, that would skew the results quite clearly in Auckland's favour. But I don't want to work just on numbers of people staying in beds. I want to know that they're good quality beds. And actually, if I looked at some tourism product as it's developed, and this has happened at every cycle trail I think that's developed, is they've started off with beds with either B&B, not necessarily high quality, not low quality, but just people opening their doors to say we can do this. Then it's gone to shared quarters being done up to a standard, and then it's come to high quality accommodation. Now, that's a trend that I can see in some products. I would love to know how Dunedin's lowest quality beds compare to, the lowest quality beds elsewhere. And that for me is, if we're doing a high-end market and we only ever provide a 3-star bed at the lowest end, that's actually really interesting to me, because I think we are a mature city offering a good product, and I'm not going to be ashamed of our quality I'd rather that than be offering 1-star bed and it being filled every night with not necessarily visitors. So, so it seems to be very blunt, the guest nights and how they worked out. And I'm just wondering, are we able to capture the quality of the bed night as opposed to the numbers?
So there are other measures based on like the Qualmark ratings, and at a Tourism New Zealand level, if you only Qualmark rated accommodation is able to be lodged with them in terms of a product, and but in terms of your 1-star rating, what we do tend to rely on to a degree is that TripAdvisor and review space can help moderate that a little bit. We can give you we can provide a report on what those ratings are in terms of those that are registered through Qualmark, but anything that's not, we don't have we're unable to comment on. The other thing that we do through our eyesight is that the team there do visit and familiar those businesses regularly, and so they're able to provide endorsements that for those that perhaps aren't Qualmarked as well. But we do. You're right. The quality is of concern, but it's not. If we don't have unless we actually have a membership type base and a qualification, it's very difficult for the likes of ourselves to be monitoring that and regulating it.
Sorry, I didn't expect you to be able to do that. I suppose what I'm intrigued with is, what are we comparing in Dunedin, where we could be saying we've actually got a high-class accommodation generally, there's nothing, I don't know exactly what the market is, and yet we're comparing it on a New Zealand standard, which may be a 1 or 2-star motel in Auckland being filled with homeless people, which is still registered as guest nights in Auckland, and I don't know. I don't know if we're comparing apples with apples here when you look at those numbers.
I think actually, just looking at Mr Christie, I think this is actually a piece of work that would probably be worthwhile investigating a little bit more and bringing back to the committee, if that's...
Councillor Lafiso.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. Thank you, staff, for your report and your focus on this mahi, on this work. I apologise in advance for my ignorance. I'm not an economist, but I'm intrigued by the gross domestic product as in terms of one measure of a successful society or city. And what I was interested in is there any way of capturing volunteer hours and the non-paid work that people do to sustain their families and communities? Like, I'm thinking of all the voluntary people, you know, like people who do Keep Dunedin Beautiful stuff, or people maintaining the maraes, hosting people, all that stuff as a measure of economic or social well-being.
From my limited knowledge of that, I think that's some of the work that is being undertaken by Treasury to look at how that can be captured. We know that GDP is a relatively blunt tool. It is the one that's available to us, and it is a measure that we can compare year on year. Is it the most appropriate? I think we would argue it's just one of the tools that we need to be measuring, and we do need to look at how we're measuring impact across other areas of our community, and we are conscious of that and working towards trying to get some better metrics for you.
Councillor O'Malley.
Thinking of public forum today, and I'm looking at the metrics that we're following here. There's an awful lot of tourism metrics here, but can we get manufacturing and education and health, because education and health are actually bigger contributors to GDP than the tourism, in the future metrics? I also note that our GDP is actually 4.8 billion now, which is actually quite large, because I know that the older number was quoted was nearer to 4 billion. And given our population hasn't been rising that much, it would imply, in fact, then that the GDP per capita is also going up. Do we have any data around the GDP per capita?
I'll take the last question first, because it's one I can remember. GDP per capita is a lag indicator, so it's certainly something that we've been discussing extensively with Infometrics regarding these statistics. So I've actually was making a note to myself when Mr Evans was speaking around that number, and we wouldn't expect to get that new information until after June, so that'll be brought back in the next report back to the committee. In terms of other key growth sectors, again, when Mr Evans was in the public forum, I was also looking at manufacturing overall, and there was some good, strong double-digit growth within the city based on that Infometrics information, which is good and interesting within there, and it is certainly something that we can bring back to the committee in terms of other sectors within there.
Because that's actually quite important perception-wise, because at the close of Cadbury's, the editorials coming out from all over New Zealand was that manufacturing in Dunedin is dying. And I think that we've really got to make sure that if we are getting numbers that are accurate where we are, this is more of a comment now than a question, but it's really important that we push that forward and we actually bring those things to the fore to change the perception of Dunedin.
Councillor Elder.
We've had two really good reports, and they've given us quite a lot of information. So when it comes to actions from those reports or recommendations from those reports, which is probably the most important part of any reporting, do we come back, or do we workshop, or do we come back with what those interpretations are, and maybe some actions that we could do, or whatever, some recommendations?
I could probably start answering that. I think we use these sets of data to inform us about whether our work program is actually hitting the mark across a range of different sectors. They are lag indicators, so obviously we will adapt as we need to around what we should be looking at in terms of a future work program. We will be reflecting on these, and we do reflect on them, and we do take councillors' points into consideration with other aspects of the work that we're going to be undertaking.
Thank you.
That's the end of questions. I've had indicated that Councillor Gary wishes to move. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Fiso. No, of the regional development. So, councillors, any debate? Councillor O'Malley.
Just a quick comment that more or less follows up on my questions. These reports are great, and I think that I'm taken of the Air New Zealand flights from Auckland to Dunedin. When they first cut them back, there was a fantastic effort by Dunedin to go back up to Auckland, bring the executives down to see the city. They changed their view of the city, and it changed their attitude to the flights that they offered, which then got people on them, and more flights are coming, and it's in a growth phase. And I really would say that these are the other things that we really need to move forward with, is that we don't necessarily have to work too much hard in advertising if the city's doing it by itself, so long as you bring those numbers up and bring them into the national psyche, so that people can then go, if I am going to do an international engineering problem, Dunedin is one of the cluster spots. Thank you.
Mayor Cull.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on the comment. I think Councillor Laufiso made a comment about using other metrics other than GDP. And I think it is appropriate in these future reports. It's appropriate in determining how the city is doing across a number of indicators, in light of the fact that we know that the 4 well-beings are being returned to the purpose of local government. So we are being given a mandate, again, to operate in the environmental, cultural, economic and social areas. So it's appropriate that we look at the indicators from those areas too. And I note that the government has just recently indicated in this budget, Minister of Finance Robertson said that this would be the last budget where GDP was the only indicator, that they would be using social indicators as their kind of KPIs. So I think it's appropriate for us to consider using those too, because as we know, GDP is not only a blunt instrument, it's a completely inaccurate one. It doesn't tell you, it tells you just about nothing. So I look forward to perhaps a discussion with Infometrics about how we might measure some of the other progress in the city.
Councillor Gary, your right of reply.
Thank you. This report shows us that Dunedin is on a positive trajectory. It's growing in different areas. What we've discussed is the need for some more detail in terms of some of the metrics and some different kinds of statistics as well to fill out our knowledge. So some refining of those. But overall, it gives us a very positive view of the city and it backs up the sense that we have in terms of the momentum our city is on.
All right, councillors, I'm going to put it. All those in favour? Against? Carried. And that brings us to item 7, Enterprise Dunedin, Q3, January to March 2018 Activity Report. Mr Christie, do you want to introduce this?
I think we can just go straight to questions from councillors on this report.
We'll just get our brie in place. Councillors, questions? Councillor Gary.
Thank you, and I just wanted to start, because this is the first opportunities we've had, to congratulate the team, particularly on trends. The team did an outstanding job in both securing trends for the city and hosting it, and was applauded in all sectors for that, and it was described as being the best trends in I think 15 years. So congratulations to you all. had a question around, I noted that the World Leisure Congress in 2022 there's a bid in for that, and I was interested, Bree, if you could tell us when will we know if we've secured that?
There's often it's a bit of a process, so there's a process even to get to bidding stage. Sure. But I do think there is some urgency around this. There are some challenges that we're working through with the university and with Tourism New Zealand and other key stakeholders at the moment. But I would like to think we will know probably within the next 3 to 4 months.
And could you talk about the bespoke study Dunedin directory on page 62? It was produced to support 6 Dunedin high schools. So this was some printed collateral that was taken. Is this the first time we've done this, Mr. Liggett?
So Study Dunedin produces a regular directory. This is just another way that the program and the Study Dunedin coordinator is supporting schools going into market. And this is one of the first times we've actually developed a specific one for the German market, in this case, in Hausch. So we understand it was well received and it supported the schools that were going into market.
Brilliant. And Tech Week is already upon us. Can you give us just a quick update on how that's going? I attended the panel discussion on Friday night, which was excellent. Could you just give us a wee update?
Yeah, unfortunately, I couldn't make the event on Friday night myself, but I certainly have 3 members of my team that are racing around furiously with Tech Week. They understand that it has gone very well with over 40 events planned throughout the week. We're very excited with it. It will give us some more time to think, though, for next year, in terms of the activities that we can keep on pushing with it. But we're very excited about it, and we'll provide a fuller report back to the committee around the outcomes on the event itself.
Thank you, and thank you very much for your work.
Councillor O'Malley.
A quick observation question. At Trends, the Trends conference was held entirely inside the one room, and it is the only area in New Zealand that has a big enough conference centre space that can occupy that space. So we should suggest we can think about changing the Edgar Centre to the Edgar Sports and Conference Centre. The reason being, it is actually the only conference centre in New Zealand capable of carrying such a big conference in one room, and I think it's something that we should consider as we talk about our capacity.
Councillor Lord.
Well, that was...
Enough banter.
Please comment.
Yeah, look, I just had a question, Fraser. I don't know if you can answer it or not, but I still like the idea of having our economic goals, 10,000 extra jobs and an average of 10,000 of income. Now, I know I asked questions about this recently, and I got a headline in the paper that said something about falling short of target, and I have no problem falling short of a target. I have a much bigger problem not having a target or a goal, and I don't think these goals necessarily at any point have to be whatever you call it, mainlined all the way through. You might have 500 jobs the first year, by the end you might be getting 2,000 jobs. But I just wondered, do you have statistics on where these two figures are at, these two metrics? I didn't see it in the report.
No. Look, the two metrics are jobs and GDP per capita. We are getting closer in terms of the work with Infometrics around the jobs numbers and tracking that. There are some constraints and challenges when we get that information, but we will keep on regularly providing updates to the committee and to our city partners around that. The GDP per capita one is even a little bit more challenging, just because it relies on two actually inputs into there, obviously GDP growth and obviously changes in population. We're trying to work with Infometrics as much as we can to get that information as quickly as we can. But again, it's something that we'll bring back to the next committee in terms of an update after we've had that discussion with Benji Patterson on that one as well.
Would it be fair to assume, and I know you shouldn't assume, but would it be fair to assume, based on the fact that we have had, I mean, the last two reports, I think there's a lot of positive in that, and I just think of, like, in the last report, even Ed Sheeran, you get 60-odd thousand visitors turn up in the city, that must create either someone is getting paid more for doing all the work, or we're employing more people, so we can be reasonably satisfied that things must be heading in the right direction.
certainly, the last discussion we had around this, there were 3 clear years of growth, both in terms of jobs and GDP per capita, and that is a good trend. That is moving forward for the city. I agree. I think this is a cumulative activity, and over time, as we develop and build and invest in sectors and work with city partners regarding this, I think that will grow more. That will develop more momentum around this. So I'm still optimistic. They are challenging goals, but I'm still optimistic in terms of us meeting or addressing the pace within the program.
Thank you.
Councillor Laufiso.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure who this question is for. I was just following on from Councillor Lord's questions in terms of success and continuing to meet those targets, those aspirations. But if we were to have another global financial crisis, is that part of your mahi, part of your work program to do projections or think of contingency plans for that kind of stuff?
It is a good question. Yes, we do touch on that across the different sectors. We're mindful of impacts across, whether it's tourism, manufacturing, tech sector, just where those challenges might be globally and what could potentially impact on those. It is worth bearing in mind too, we're looking at a third measure in terms of the GDP and job growth are 2 important ones, but the quality of life is something we're also very mindful of in the work that we're undertaking.
Councillor Elder.
I'm just looking at public relations marketing activities and campaigns and noting that our international visitor numbers aren't as high as they could be. I was just wondering what else was happening in that space and whether, in fact, budget-wise, we need to increase the budget on that spend. That's a hard question, I'm sorry, because you guys always want more budget.
When we get a little bit further afield, obviously we don't have the same level of connections with media over there, and that's where our travel trade, sales and marketing part of the team really kicks in. So over there, training frontliners, training agents to ensure that they're including our products and our accommodation and our city in their itineraries. So, our PR and promotions person, regularly is in contact with media, has gone to Australia to engage with media too, but then we also rely on third-party agencies to be able to assist us with that as well.
Thank you.
I have one question. I noticed you've got some details in here in the report around the benefits of Gig City, so the amount of money that's come through the Gig Fund and the last round of that, and the fact that we've got quite a lot of usage of the free gigabit Wi-Fi network. But have you got any idea of how much benefit has occurred as a result of the discounted rates that those who've connected to gigabit services have
Thank you, Councillor Staines. This is a task that we've been working through over the last few weeks with Chorus, and we've recently just had an updated number around it, but between the start of the competition up to this point, it's estimated that the savings, if you like, or the benefit that's arisen from the discounted program is in around the $7.3 million mark. So it is quite significant. We've had some updated figures come through even as recently as today, which broke down both the monthly figure, but the updated aggregate figure is $7.3 million.
Sounds good. Councillor Gary.
Just touching on the media coverage, looking forward, what do you expect the impact of the media that we hosted during Trends, and that included, I believe CNN, I've certainly met the CNN person, and I think National Geographic were there, and some pretty high-powered media from all around the world. What is your expectation of the impact that's going to have going forward? I know it's quite a hard question, but there's no certainty in it.
No, there isn't. But at the same time, I'd be surprised if we did. We've seen a lot come through already, a lot of really positive things, particularly in the blogging and influencer space off the back of Trends, and also all of the sellers that attend Trends as ambassadors as well. But from an international perspective, you know, sometimes they can be writing for their publication, you know, for an article to come in a year's time. So, you know, we're not going to see the immediate impacts of having the media there at Trends. So we have, in partnership, I guess, with the city marketing team, is we have a media monitor that will start to track that, and obviously we continue to follow the media and engage with the media that we met at Trends, and would be looking for the results. I understand Tourism New Zealand, obviously they bring the large media contingent over themselves, so they have really robust tracking procedures.
From the feedback you got at the time, what was your impression of their experience?
Oh, you know, overall, everyone was extremely positive. I think the city showed not only its capacity to, you know, host large events and be able to, you know, be able to cater for that many people wanting to see our tourism attractions, but I just think they were probably quite surprised at the breadth of what we could offer, and the fact that you could go out to the peninsula and do an experience out there, you know, the Royal Albatross, the penguins, and be back in the city and have a really great urban experience as well. So by having that activity day and having over 800 people out seeing our attractions, you know, it's the sort of money can't buy experience. And as I've heard the people talking about, I mean, Mother Nature played her part, and people coming back on the train at sort of 5 o'clock in the evening, and that golden sunset that was happening, you know, it's just incredible. So yeah, I mean, there's going to be a lot of monitoring moving forward to see the impact of Trends and how the operators have benefited from it, and also because tourism industry, Aotearoa will do a economic impact study out of it too, so be able to put some real numbers beside
When would we expect to see that, Brett?
Probably in around 6 months' time. So they'll do some initial surveying directly post Trends and their feedback, but then around 6 months out they'll do the same again.
Great, thank you.
Councillor Wiley, you've indicated you wish to move. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Wilson. Councillor Wiley, do you wish to speak? No. Councillor Law.
I seem to be the only one talking today, but I just thought that these reports, I'm really quite impressed with just how they are tracking. I just think, you know, even this year we got one paragraph on page 61 saying about sexy summer jobs. We used to get reports on that, whole reports, and I just think you've created 13 new roles, placed 46 interns. I just think that's really quite outstanding, and if you could almost miss it if you didn't read that report. And there's just a lot of stuff. I think of the number of trips that I've been on since I've been on this council to different businesses around the place, and overwhelmingly we get people saying these are fantastic people that we're dealing with in the Economic Development Unit. So I just think really good report again.
Councillor O'Malley.
I was going to reiterate my question comment earlier on. I think that we really do need to actually emphasise it. Came as a surprise to realise that in fact we are the only city in the country that can actually put that bigger conference under one roof. And as we look at the Edgar Centre's future and its life, and while other cities are spending fortunes on conference centres, we might want to consider the fact that we actually have a capacity inside the city that we didn't, I think, realise we had. And as we are looking at Great Wilshire, and as we are looking forward to, you know, advertising the city for its ability to carry conferences, we maybe want to be considering ones the size of Trends, and actually saying we can put you under one roof, and can anybody else do that? Thank you.
Councillor Gary.
Couple of comments. The report is a very positive one in so many different areas. and it gives me a lot of hope for the future for our city. It's exciting times. I'm mindful, though, that we need to ensure that we resource this work really well, both in staff and monetary terms, to ensure that we can get the greatest capacity and progress in this really important work for our city, which is clearly already showing that it's producing jobs and opportunities for people to both move here and those who live here now.
And speaking to this one, I just want to reiterate what I think is a great job of work that's being done in Enterprise Dunedin at the moment. You know, you look through this report and you see so many good activities that are being undertaken, and you have to remember that during this quarter, they were flat out with organising trends, and the feedback that I got, and I know Councillor Gary and Councillor Wiley, who were at some of those events, and some of your other councillors were probably there, the feedback we were getting was fantastic. From some of the international people I spoke to, they were really impressed with what we had here, with some of the tourist operators, really impressed with the delivery that we had for trends. People who'd been to other trends in Auckland, Christchurch, Wellington, saying just how fantastic this was and that it was the best one they'd been to. So the feedback was really, really strong, and I'd just like to add my word of thanks to all of the team that were involved with trends. I think as a city you managed to pull off a real blinder, and we look forward to you being able to drag it back here again in a few years' time. So that brings us to right of reply. Councillor Wiley.
Thank you. You know, we started off today hearing from Gareth Evans telling us about how he was even reluctant to look at coming to Dunedin, but the challenge and the opportunity is what took over, and how he's now such a key ambassador for the city, like many others that have moved here. But when you read this report, you just have to look and see, one, how I wouldn't say efficient, but how well the team at Enterprise Dunedin are at getting a shitload of stuff done, to be quite frank. And I think that's the bottom line. When you read this, you see this is one quarter, and it's amazing to see how much was done and how much was achieved for right across the city. And I think that was really, really important. So I take my hat off and say thanks to every one of the team members and to John. I think it really does become a great report. You know, personally, when I look at the gig city number of 1.25 million people accessing the gig in March, you know, that's a frightening amount of number for a population of our size. When you look at the business information, and also in the previous items we've seen, the visitor and the travel trade, seeing the stories that consistently keep coming out about Dunedin, and obviously from trends. You know, Ed Sheeran, when he came to town, you know, even this report doesn't really capture how important that was for the city, but the vibe and what it did for everybody that lives here as well. And we can look at all these numbers, and we can talk about, you know, this looks great on a balance sheet, or it looks, you know, great for the people visiting us. But it's also great for the people that live here. It's great for us. And I think that's the key that we really have to look at and say, we've got this quarter in play, now we've got to keep building on and keep building on and keep building on, so we are an even stronger city and having an even stronger front and great perception of what we really are. You look at the study and the work that's been done in that area, good food. So all in all, a very good report. Appreciate everybody's work in it. I just hope we can continue funding and grow this area and go the next steps. Thank you.
Against? Carried. That brings us to item 8. Now, just as a reminder to councillors, there is a supplementary attachment in the grey papers. Just be conscious if you are asking questions on film that the questions around that supplementary paper should be asked in the proposed session. So welcome, Anthony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, councillors. I'm sure most of you have had the opportunity to meet Mr. Anthony Deaker. So Anthony is our Aratoi coordinator and also our champion of film within the city. And so what we have done is we've prepared an update regarding our activities, predominantly actually over the last 24 months, but it provides a picture of the investment that's been made in film and some of the outcomes that we've been achieving, and also the direction where we ultimately would like to keep pushing out. So I'm sure you've had an opportunity to review the report, and between ourselves we'll answer any questions.
Questions, councillors? Councillor Wiley.
Thank you. And a question around what involvement and opportunities are there for the university and the Polytech in this space?
I'll hand that one over to Mr. Deaker, who's been doing quite a bit of work in that area.
So we've had a number of producers coming into the city, and in some cases I've taken them directly in to meet with the heads of the creative faculty at the Polytech. I understand the Polytech are in review of their programs around film and television at the moment. Otago Polytechnic picked up the programs that Aoraki were delivering, and they're reviewing them because they've been oversubscribed, and they're looking at changes to the way they offer education in the film and television space. And so they've been interested to meet with the producers that have been coming in to look at Dunedin as a potential destination for their work. So there's an obvious synergy there with the potential in growth and the potential to match that with growth in education to create opportunities through for students. We have been able to place secondary students onto film sets in the last 6 months, which has been a great outcome. That was a real thrill. Working with Tokomariro College, their teacher drove the senior pupil up 5 days in a row, and that young guy had an unpaid job as a runner, but that was a real job and real experience on a working film set. And so that's just a quick anecdote around the way the industry works is very much geared towards internships, and from that we would expect to see a growth into real jobs.
Mr. Gary.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Deaker, for your report, which gives a lot of detail, and clearly a lot of work's been done. I'm really interested to hear a bit more from you about, on page 67, the opportunities and some of the challenges possibly that we have in this area. Would you like to speak to that a little more and just enlarge upon those points?
Thank you. This has been a real world developmental process that we've been hosting we've been hosting producers with projects that they would like to bring into the city, and so it's given us a great opportunity to see through their eyes what do they see in the city, what are the opportunities and what are the constraints, and so that's been a progressive discussion, and over time our team, our officers' capacity to say to them, yeah, that's sorted, is growing. So we've been, I sat Louise from Eyesight down with the producers, and she could allay their concerns about accommodation, for example, that yes, we can find beds for your 300 crew. And yes, and Louise could talk to some of the other suppliers that she knew who had flat deck trucks, who had generators, who had everything that a film crew would look for. The producers visiting have all noted how compact the city is and how ease of transport is great here, that they could be staying in their motels and hotels and get to the location within 30 minutes. and be at work is remarkable by any standards, and they were really excited that they could do that and that their crew could then go out that night, enjoy our cafes and bars, for example. We have the film, I want to emphasise that nothing's real here until it's real, that I've been really concerned about an optimistic statement about this and this is going to happen, because in fact we don't know until they're here and doing it. But so film works with producers who are typically not in the country, working through proxies, and for the commercials it's location scouts who then become the locations managers, and they're looking at, can we get access to those locations that we want, and is there any hassle? Can we find crew? Can we find accommodation? And what's the weather going to be like? And we've had 5 commercials that have shot here on stunning days, so the weather's always great. In terms of constraints, the next piece of work that we're going to be looking at is an audit of crew capacity in the city. We want to be able to deliver in succinct form to the producers that they can find X, Y and Z staff here resident in the city, and then that adds to their incentive to come, that they don't have to pay per diems to bring crew in from out of the city. They don't have to book accommodation because the crew's living here already. So that's our next piece of work, is really to demonstrate that yes, there are crew here, and exactly where do they sit in the food chain and what skills and experiences have they got.
Thank you for going over those. I was also interested in, because obviously even if you've got all the compact city and you've got the accommodation, etc., and the crew, if you don't have the location, it's a moot point really. So how is the work coming along in terms of locating? I get a sense that the location thing is coming along really well. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, thank you. That's one of the great opportunities that has come from working with the producers, is that we've been able to identify gaps in our locations library, and we've been actively filling those and working out how best to deliver and communicate as well. So there's been systems organisation as well as actually the quality and the range of images that we've got. Our office over time has contracted location scouts who are working in the city to shoot the city for us, so we actually own images. Locations images are different than tourism, than business, than media images. That they're looking with a different eye, so it is quite a particular collection that we need. And what we've found is that we didn't have, we had a lot of built heritage, we had a lot of urban scenes, we put scouts on the Taieri Gorge train and in and out of the city, but we weren't showing off what the city has in terms of its wild open spaces, wild beaches, wild forest. There was a guy in particular looking for craggy cliffs and gnarly trees.
I remember that email.
So we didn't have any. We've now got a couple of folders of gnarly trees. So that has. I think we're getting there in terms of being able to demonstrate what the city's got in terms of those locations.
Great, thank you very much for your work, Anthony.
Councillor Lord.
Yeah, look, I'm just not sure if it's just a typo or not, but I'm just on page 64.6. It says that the spend on film production rose 67% in 2017 from 25 to 34 million, but that won't be 67%. That'll be more like 36% or something. So do you know
I think you have discovered a typo there, Councillor Lord, and we will correct that.
Okay,
thanks.
Thank you.
Councillor Hawkins.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen. I had a filmmaker get in touch with me earlier this week, anxious about the threat of losing access to the Fortune Theatre's extensive wardrobe as an asset for costuming, there being no other real alternative south of Christchurch that could offer that. Are these the kinds of concerns been relayed to you, and are there any conversations that you're aware of looking to alleviate those concerns?
Yes, Thank you. Yes, been actively involved in discussions to retain the wardrobe intact as a resource for film and TV. I believe it's a collection of national significance, and have been talking to people who have experience in wardrobe in film and TV about capacity to jump in and potentially house the collection short term. So that's an ongoing discussion. Also the tools, we were really interested in the resource that the Fortune had around set building and prop building, and had discussed prior to the announcement of the closure with some of the visiting producers that the Fortune could have workshop space available for set building to work with their productions. So it is a loss which we can come back from, but that was there was a nice fit already with both of those elements to support incoming projects.
Yeah, thank you. So just to be clear, you'd see the retention of the wardrobe as a collection, as an economic development asset for the city in terms of supporting this work?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Councillor Lefiso.
Thank you, Mr Chair, and thank you, kia ora mo tō mahi, and congratulations. I am south of our Philistine, so I'm not very up to date with industry or stuff, but I'm just curious, having read the report, are there lessons, do you see yourself as ahead of the curveball in terms of New Zealand cities supporting the film industry, or are there lessons yet to be learned?
We'll probably do a double act on this one, I think, in terms of a response. We have been looking and trying to understand how other cities and towns treat film or enable film within their cities, and we think there are lessons to learn, and those lessons actually correlate with what we think are strengths within the city, both in terms of our culture, our business culture, and the way that the industry works. Perhaps, Anthony, do you want to talk through a little bit more of that?
It's a complex question, because on one side, the country is as big as a state in Australia and is as big as a city in the US. And for the industry to grow in a particular region, it relies on the country being able to attract some of those significant projects. What I describe is that we're building a snowball, and the way we're building it is by great engagement and doing our best to make friends, build trust, and then find ways to support the inquiries that come across the desk. And those are at all levels. So I'm going out for coffees and meetings with filmmakers within our community as much as I am with visiting producers, because we're looking both ways. We want to grow activity up from within, and we want it to be possible for filmmakers to remain here and be sustainable in their businesses within the city. And that will partly be supported by our ability to attract in. So there's a precarious workflow with the crew that we have in the city. They run project to project, and they're scrambling for $5 to pull off their projects. So it's a privilege to go alongside those projects in their development and work with those people, and for them to trust me for them to share what they're trying to work through. And so I'm learning from that about how we can play our game and potentially position the city to be a great nurturing place to grow film up from within the city. I think going back to the core on your question, the feedback that we're getting is that we've been great to work with, and that must be by comparison with somewhere else. But that's not just us. I think that's also the city, and that's, so we've seen some amazing examples in the last 6 months where, and the filmmakers have been gobsmacked by the friendliness and the quality of the engagement and the level of support from the local community. And what results in that is a sense of pride, you know, pride in place and the feel good. I don't think we can underestimate what we've seen just in the TV commercials that have been shot here, and then the way they reflect back our beautiful city and the cool people here. So we're just focusing on our own game to be as strong and as encouraging as we possibly can, but we're also engaged in networks nationally. So I don't see myself in competition with Tauranga or with Wellington and Auckland. I just want us to grow our piece of the pie. We have two, film and screen in New Zealand is really dominated in Auckland and Wellington. Queenstown and Dunedin to a degree are the third, we're the third region. But, you know, the percentages are very high in those other cities, and so that's a question of, you know, we've heard it in other conversations, you guys have heard it in other conversations today, that we've got ways to grow the city, partly because those other cities are harder to work in, and it's more attractive for people to be here. One last anecdote, I was at film meetings in Queenstown 2 weeks ago, and I always make a beeline for the people I haven't met in the cup of tea afterwards, and was speaking to an Australian-based scout who was giving me the anecdote that she'd heard about Dunedin, and it sounded like what had happened in Australia, where Sydney was the centre of everything, and there was this rapid drift to Melbourne when Sydney got too hard, too expensive, the politics were gnarly, and she was surmising, and I hope it's true, that that was the vibe that she was hearing about Dunedin, that it's the place to move to.
Councillor Gary.
Yes, I just had another question to delve into that we're good to work with anecdote. And I was thinking back to the Lloyd's Bankhead. Can you tell us about that cross-council work? Because one of my favourite words at the moment is nimble, and we're not known for being nimble on a number of fronts, but that's just local government. But could you talk about how that panned out in terms of that project, for example, or maybe another?
Thank you. Well, at that same meeting I was at Queenstown recently, this Phil Turner, who was the scout who was working with us, said that he was also working with some of our neighbours down south and other cities up the coast. And he was working for a production company based in Auckland, and the Auckland production company knew that they would not be able to get onto beaches around Auckland, so they didn't even try, that it's got really hard for a number of reasons, and mostly it sounds bureaucratic. So Phil started calling in the first week of January, and by the time we had worked through the logistics of what he needed, we could direct him to some of the beaches where there was existing permits to run horses around Dunedin. We could warm up everyone across council within parks and reserves and within sports fields, so we could get access to Grant Bray's soccer club for toilets and kitchens. That this was about to happen. Was there going to be any issues that they would need to resolve before we could sign off a permit? So we'd basically been able to work through the whole permit before the permit arrived, and could get it back out to the producer within 24 hours. And that they just thought that was amazing, and really secured that project here and did a great boost to our reputation for ease of business. I just wanted to add that in our experience, the film and screen have been good citizens. You know, we've also been asking about their pay rates, and so we've got some nice comparisons that, you know, carpenters employed on film are paid more than carpenters who are building houses, for example. We've been impressed by their commitment to health and safety of all of their crew, and we've been really impressed by their commitment to the flora and fauna and respect for the conditions that they're coming into. So the film works on the idea that they have to come back. You know, they want to come back, and they want other films to come back. So access to locations will dry up if they're not good citizens.
Okay, that seems to be the end of the questions. Councillor Elder.
Good news story twice today, and that is that people, it sounds like we're developing business on a nimble basis. And I was just wondering what the feedback for you was about the varying geography and natural beauty of Dunedin and how it compares.
Oh. Well, it's amazing that even within the city boundaries you can go from dry, arid to misty rainforest, and you can go from built urban. With one of the producers that have moved into the city, he's really keen on getting a hold of all the left-hand drives because he's sure that Dunedin can do New York. And so that's a great endorsement for what the city can offer.
So in the sense of variety of built environment as well, like the railway station has a different feel to, say, the Art Deco of the Early Settlers Museum.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and this chap loves our alleyways as well. He's thrilled that we've got such grungy old alleyways right in the middle of town.
That's fantastic, isn't it?
Yeah, so let's not all
grungy alleyways are an asset sometimes.
Yeah.
We're going to have to be a little bit careful with our urban renewal then. All right, look, that brings us to the end of questions. I'm happy to move that we note the paper. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Gary. Does anybody wish to speak to this? If not, I'll put it. All in favour? Aye. Against? Carried. Now, Councillor Benson-Pope, you have item 8A.
I have formalised the motion I articulated earlier, Mr Chairman, and Ms Lapham has it. I think it speaks for itself. We know we've had a lot of change, and we know there's huge change in the formal mail system, and I guess we all suffer from mail from Andersons Bay to Musselburgh being sorted in Christchurch, and the delay that entails, logical or not. And so I was further concerned when I saw the news item a week or so ago about possible downsizing. I think that's how we should refer to it, possible downsizing of the operations of New Zealand Post - Kiwi Bank at both Dunedin South and Dunedin North. And mostly surprised because, in my observation, they seem to be extremely busy sites, both of them, for both activities. And I'm particularly concerned about, well, both actually, but they perform different functions. In Dunedin South, the Post Bank, Kiwi Bank site is a very high traffic generator and vitality generator, more so I think than anywhere in the area, apart from my hairdresser. And in the case of...
Well used.
Takes a long time. In the case of Dunedin North, when we're looking at work on the campus, when we know that route past the Museum Reserve up Albany is one of the main desire lines to the med school, to the city and the rest of it, and the observation of others about the frequency and size of queues in that place, I was really surprised. And the reason I bring it to the table is because as these discussions proceed, it will be a shame if New Zealand Post were left in any doubt about the view of this council. I don't imagine we're going to argue about it too much. And I think it's appropriate, singularly appropriate, that we should also communicate that concern, if you share my concern, to not only New Zealand Post but our local members of Parliament. And I'm therefore happy to move what is on the board.
I just want to thank Councillor Benson for bringing this up and support him wholeheartedly in this. And I'm thinking of a term from economics called cumulative causation, which comes out of the business case here. And it has two sides to the sword. If you take a volume-based system analysis, you end up rewarding the bigger centres, and on the other side of that sword's blade, you end up taking away from the smaller centres. And then those centres have less activity, they have less resources in them to conduct business, and therefore get weakened again by your decision. So I'm really, actually, I would go and convey this onto the government to say, please don't bring this model upon us anymore. We needed this to stop right now. Thank you.
I think it's interesting that we spoke earlier about the success of Gigtown and what it's done, and but the issue with New Zealand Post, I think it's been a victim of its own lack of seeing opportunities with Trade Me earlier on and tried to compete with them. But the Kiwi Bank operations is key to a lot of people who want to invest in Dunedin and New Zealand, to want to do their banking, and in light of what may yet come out of a possible banking review, it would be interesting to see the stories and the loyalty that they have to Australian-owned banks, and New Zealanders want to have to Australian-owned banks. But Kiwi Bank is something that not all people can do online yet, and it is a much loved institution by especially a lot of older people, and for that end, especially in South Dunedin, I see it as being key and pivotal that it stays especially there, where they can get front-end counter assistance doing things, and the same with New Zealand Post. People, the older generation do still like using post, and we need to keep those, especially in the demographics with older populations like South Dunedin.
I agree with Kate in the sense that not only does it serve a commercial role, but it actually serves a social service role. And I think in particular South Dunedin, where there's a lot of older people, there's a lot of people who don't have cars. So it's much easier for them to access good services if they're local. And so I would commend Kiwi Bank to start thinking of what their role is in the social service part of that, you know, in the sense of their service to those people. I mean, because they do licences, they do all sorts of things, and those people will find it very difficult to access those if it moves away.
I concur wholeheartedly with what my colleagues have said about the importance of Post Office and Kiwi Bank as a social hub and that personal service for often vulnerable parts of our community. But the comment I would like to say also is that given on occasions it takes 2 weeks for an item of post to come from the city to my home in Broad Bay, that is the most extreme time it's taken. I shudder to think how long it might take in the future if this happens.
Well, I certainly support this resolution. It beggars understanding to think that an organisation that was set up to serve New Zealanders and you know, that is all New Zealanders, would choose to look at downsizing its operations by removing branches from probably the 2 suburbs in Dunedin that need their services and probably use their services the most. It certainly, for South Dunedin, I think this is just, well, it's Kiwi Bank and Post Bank banging a nail in the South Dunedin coffin as we're trying to stop the nails going in and opening the lid again and trying to get some life there. It really does upset me, and I fully support bringing our local members of Parliament up to speed on this and discussing how they might be able to provide some influence or some assistance in maintaining these services. So with that, I'll go to Councillor Benson-Pope, your right of reply. No right of reply? Okay. I'll put it. All those in favour? Aye. Against? Carried. That brings us to the point where I will move that we... Oh, sorry. Items for the Chair. We better get that out of the way. Are there any items for the Chair? If not, I will move that we go into public excluded for the reasons laid out in the order paper. Seconded. Councillor Gary. All in favour? Against? Carried. We'll take a very short break and then we'll get on to the second half.